And I think we're going to be safe again tonight. We haven't had a rain out all season, and we shouldn't tonight unless my theory is correct, and that is that young people that lie grow up and become weather forecasters, but we'll see. Before we present the colors tonight, it occurs to me that these two gentlemen are here every week, and they get introduced as Legion Post 1, Legion Post 3, but they're real gentlemen, and I'd like you to know who they are. So carrying the American flag tonight is Terry Remick. Yes. And Barney Cooper is carrying the Montana flag. These guys are here every week, every summer, and we really appreciate it. It puts a little extra special to our start of our concert. So with that in mind, would you please rise if you can, and we'll present the colors and the national anthem. American Legion Post 3, Barney and Terry, thank you. Christmas, 1960. You were there. What was the big hit of the season for the movie? The 3.5-hour blockbuster called Exodus. And Robert Redford's big first starring role, Eva Marie Saint, Sal Mineo. Most of you remember that, right? All right, so we'll refresh your memory with some music from that movie, Exodus. Now you remember, right? This next piece is arranged by a man named James Swearingen. Jim Swearingen wrote a lot of pieces for band and became a sort of formula writer, and after a while people went, oh, another Swearingen piece. But this is different. This is an arrangement of funicula, funiculi. I think it's the other way around, isn't it? And, but funiculi, funiculi. So we'll have some fun with this. You'll recognize the tune. Don't go to sleep. This one's really fast. I'll bet you recognize that one too. This next piece is from a ballet by Reinhold Glier. Was actually born in Ukraine, and but in the time that he was born, it was controlled by the Soviet Union, so he is recognized as a Soviet composer, despite the fact that he's Ukrainian. But I thought it might be fun to play something of that nature. This is Russian Sailor's Dance. It's one of the many dances in the Red Poppy Ballet by Glier. You could just about see those Russian dancers, couldn't you? You guys probably all remember the Ravel Bolero if you saw the movie 10. This isn't the piece. But it's something very similar to that. I think it's a bit of a knockoff, I think, from Ravel. But this is Glenn Osser's Bolero for Band. last week you heard an arrangement of tunes from The Lion King, and you're going to get to hear some of them again tonight, a different arrangement. And lots of times I don't think folks understand the difference between the composer and the arranger. The composer of this music was Elton John. The arranger, meaning how he arranged the notes for all of the band, is John Higgins. Last week's arranger was Calvin Custer. So different arrangers take the same music, take the composer's music, and arrange it for whatever group that they see that they're arranging for. So I hope that you'll enjoy this. It's a lengthy piece, but lots of different melodies in here, and most of them, if you've seen the movies at all, anything of The Lion King, you'll recognize all of these. can't express what kind of musicianship it takes to pull a piece like that off with one rehearsal last night. So, excellent musicians, excellent musicians. So we have some people to thank this evening, and you already heard about Legion Post 3, and we really appreciate their being here. I wanted to point out that with Bud's passing, and well, actually when he was contracted Lewy body dementia, we were at a quandary about what to do for conductors, and so we discovered that we're pretty conductor rich around here. All of you that have or will conduct the band this summer, would you stand up, please? Conductors. And missing from the group tonight is John Gemmerling. He conducted that first concert. That's why we have to be so cautious about the weather. With all these good conductors, we got to be really careful about lightning here. We do want to recognize our sponsors. We are a nonprofit organization, and I mean nonprofit. All of our operating expenses are through donations. And with the generous sponsorship of Johnson Madison, Dr. Zana Zook, and the Simonich family, we're in good shape for tonight. Would you give them a hand, please? Boy, the season went fast. We have 1 week left. Lisa Sundquist will be conducting next week, so we want to be sure everybody comes back, and bring your checks and your $100 bills and throw them into the zoot back there as you leave. So we'll keep us going for another season. We'll go ahead now with a march by J.W. Howe. Quite an interesting story about this man. He was a prisoner of war in World War II. The Germans captured him. He was a British soldier. While he was in the camp, in the concentration camp, he started a band. And somehow they got instruments, and he had like a Glenn Miller big band going in the prison camp. And he was also, during that time, doing some composing. And after the war, he became the head of the Scots Guard, if you're familiar with them, the Scots Guard band. And so J.W. Howe is going to entertain us tonight with 3 different parts of his march. It's all in one called Pentland Hills, but you'll hear, I think, 3 distinct different marches, last of which being Scottish. It occurred to me a couple of years ago when we played this Beatles tune that that's just for the elderly folks in the audience. This came out in 1968, I think. So a little after Glenn Miller. I think our Glenn Miller crew has kind of passed on. So I hope you see that this is right from your past. You're going to sing along with every word. And how many of you went out and got the Beatles CD when you turned 64 and played When I'm 64? I did. I did. I was going to mention that for Phil Burton, that was when the 1960 movie came out. That's when he started getting Social Security, I think. piece. I mentioned Glenn Miller a bit back, and we're going to play some tunes from the Glenn Miller Band era. Yeah. And this is called Big Band Classics. You'll hear 3 tunes in there, and I think you'll recognize them all. I won't spoil it by telling you the names at this point. I would, however, like to mention one of our band members passing. Tom Railsback, you used to see him back there in the tuba until his emphysema got to where he couldn't blow the tuba anymore, and then you'd see him back there playing the bass drum, and unfortunately he passed away a couple of weeks ago, and so I'd like you to think about how much Tom would enjoy this piece as we play Big Band Classics. By the way, that's out of order on the program. You'll understand why, I think, later. composer of this next piece at one time was the director of the Barnum and Bailey's circus band, Barnum and Bailey Brothers Circus Band, Fred Jewell. And Andrew Glover, the arranger of this, his father was a circus musician, and so he grew up around these kinds of things. And so this is, I think the marking on this should be as fast as possible, but not faster, and we'll give it a try that way. I think that answers the musical question, can this band play fast? All right, thank you so much for being here again tonight. A couple of choruses of Montana, and off we go before the rain gets here.